They say lightning doesn't strike twice, but storms will find you again and again, especially if you've already learned how to survive them. I moved to Oak Glen Estates 5 years ago because it was supposed to be safe, quiet, predictable. You mow your lawn, wave to the neighbors, pay the HOA dues, and no one bothers you. At least that's what I told myself when I signed the deed. But I didn't come here to make friends. I came here because the last time a tornado ripped through my life, it didn't just take my childhood home, it took my mother with it. I was 14. We'd been in the kitchen when the power died and the walls shook like cardboard. She shoved me into the bathtub, threw a mattress on top of me, and I didn't see her again. They found her a mile away. I learned that day that safe isn't a given. It's something you prepare for. So when I finally bought this house, a modest ranch style on the edge of the cul-de-sac, I already had a plan. Before the furniture was even in, I started digging. Not some makeshift hole. I built a proper storm shelter, reinforced concrete air vents, locking steel door, stocked supplies. A survival capsule. I didn't ask permission. I didn't need to. The land was mine, and I'd be damned if I ever let someone I loved go unprotected again. I kept to myself mostly, just me and my dog Jasper. I was the quiet guy on Hemlock Drive, the one with the military haircut, and no family photos in the window. I didn't go to the HOA meetings. I didn't complain when people parked like idiots, or when some kid egged my mailbox. That's life. Let people do their thing, I'll do mine. The trouble started small. A manila envelope taped to my front door one Saturday morning. Notice of violation. It read, typed in bold letters like they were delivering a subpoena. It said something about unapproved structures and modifications inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. I stared at it for a long time. My shelter was behind the house, barely visible, unless you were actively snooping. I hadn't advertised it. No one had complained, at least not to me. That was the first time. I heard her name, Karen Whitmore, head of the compliance committee. Lived 3 houses up with her husband, Rick, and a terrier named Muffin. She ran the monthly newsletter, chaired the neighborhood holiday lights contest, and had a face that defaulted to disapproval. She'd apparently walked past my backyard, seen the vent pipe sticking up near the fence, and opened a formal investigation. Her words, not mine. Still, I thought it would blow over. I took photos, checked the county permit. It was all in order. The shelter was entirely within code. I mailed copies to the HOA and waited. 2 weeks. Nothing. Then another letter came, this time certified. You are hereby instructed to remove the unauthorized structure within 10 business days or face monetary penalties. They even attached a fine schedule. That was when I started to feel the old tension again, the one I hadn't felt since Kandahar. The sensation that someone else's mistake was about to become your catastrophe. I had spent my entire adult life preparing for the moment everything went sideways. In combat, in disaster drills, in quiet domestic routines. But here, in a sun-soaked suburb with lilac hedges and recycling bins, the danger didn't come from the sky. It came from petty people with a little too much power and absolutely no understanding of what it feels like to lose everything in 30 seconds of wind. I tried calling the HOA, left voicemails, got generic emails from a Melissa at the management company saying my concerns would be reviewed at the next board meeting. I even walked to Karen's door once, polite as could be, and tried to explain. I told her why the shelter mattered, what I'd lived through, how the vent pipe could be painted, disguised, anything she wanted. She looked at me like I'd told her I was burying landmines in my garden. It's not personal, she said, her smile brittle. But the rules are the rules. I remember walking away from her porch with something cold settling in my chest. Not fear. Not yet. It was the prelude to it. The sense that a line had been crossed, not by me, but by someone who didn't know they were playing with things that could get people killed. That night, thunder rolled far off in the distance. A dry storm, the kind that just teases. Jasper curled up on my boots while I sat at the kitchen table rereading every HOA rule, every county code, every permit I'd filed. I wasn't going to dismantle that shelter. Not now. Not ever. Because the truth is, a storm doesn't care about your regulations. And when it comes, you'd better have a place to hide. The ground behind my house was hard clay, the kind that broke shovels and left your palms raw by the end of the day. But I dug anyway. I dug until the sweat soaked through my shirt until the calluses on my hands split open and bled until I hit the right depth and knew it would hold. There was no crew, no contractor. Just me, Jasper, lying nearby in the grass, and the low whir of an AM radio, giving weather reports from 3 counties over. It wasn't a project, it was a mission. I poured the concrete myself, mixing it by hand wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow. Rebar. Air filtration vents. A crank-powered fan. I did it all over 2 months after work every weekend, 1 layer at a time. It wasn't because I didn't trust other people. I just didn't want to owe anyone. And the thing is, I did it by the book. Before I even broke ground, I called the city planning office, pulled the paperwork, filed the forms, paid the permit fee. I still had the receipt folded in a drawer dated 2 years ago. The inspector came out a gruff guy named Monty, who said hell more people ought to be doing this with the way the weather's been. He passed it, signed it. That shelter was as legal as the slab the house sat on. But Karen didn't care about that. After that first violation notice, I tried to keep my head down. I figured maybe she'd get bored. Maybe her HOA crusade would turn towards someone's flower beds or the color of a fence post, but she didn't. In fact, things got worse. She started sending compliance agents, not city officials, just private contractors, hired by the HOA into my yard when I wasn't home. The first time I noticed was when I found boot prints in the damp soil near the shelter door. The next week, the back gate was left unlatched. Jasper growled for hours that night. I set up a motion camera, the kind I'd used on forward operating bases. Caught them red-handed 2 men in HOA logo jackets, walking around my property, taking photos of the shelter, measuring with tape. One even tried the door handle. I sent the footage to the management company. No response. So I printed stills from the video and hand-delivered them to Karen's mailbox. No note, just the evidence. The next morning, she was standing at the edge of my lawn when I left for work. "I saw what you dropped off," she said, voice clipped. "We're within our rights to inspect properties in violation." I stared at her. "You're not law enforcement." "No," she said. "But the board grants temporary easement to ensure compliance. It's in the bylaws." I knew those bylaws front to back by then, and there was no such clause. But people like Karen count on one thing: you not pushing back, you not calling their bluff. I didn't respond. I just stared at her until she turned around and walked off like she'd won something. But I'd already started compiling everything. I documented every letter, every visit, every email. I printed it, cataloged it, highlighted every regulation they violated. I even recorded the call I made to the county clerk confirming that my shelter was legal and grandfathered into any new aesthetic codes passed after installation. I brought the full packet to the next HOA meeting. It was my first time attending one. The clubhouse was overdecorated: faux bronze chandeliers, dark laminate tables, stacks of bottled water. No one drank. Karen sat at the head of the U-shaped arrangement, a microphone in front of her like she was presiding over a court. There were maybe 20 people there, mostly older, mostly passive, the kind who want peace and quiet and a sense of control over what their neighbors are doing. I waded through the budget updates, the pool maintenance report, a debate over whether someone's Halloween decorations had been too demonic. Then, during the open comment period, I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rant. I just laid the folder down on the table and said, "My name is Michael Grant. I live at 212 Hemlock. I built a storm shelter 2 years ago. It's permitted, it's inspected, it's legal. Your contractors have trespassed on my property, and your fines are baseless. If they continue, I'll seek a restraining order and file civil action for harassment." Silence, then some murmurs. Karen picked up the folder, leafed through it without reading, and handed it to one of the board members with a frown. "That may be your opinion," she said, microphone amplifying every syllable. "No," I said calmly. "That's the law." That was the moment I saw it, something shift in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Annoyance. Embarrassment. She hadn't expected me to show up. People like her never do. They expect you to cave quietly, to move, to pay the fines. I left before the meeting ended. As I stepped out into the night air, I could hear them discussing budget allocations for the clubhouse Wi-Fi. Like nothing had just happened. But I knew better. People like Karen don't back down. They dig in. 3 days later, I came home to find the shelter's entrance blocked. 2 steel posts had been driven into the ground in front of the door. A chain stretched between them, padlocked tight. A red placard dangled from the chain. "Dangerous structure, do not enter under HOA review." It wasn't a city notice. It wasn't legal. It was a lie printed on fake authority. But it wasn't just about control anymore. It was war. It was taped dead center on my front door like a final warning in a hostage situation. Bold red letters across a laminated sheet of paper. Second notice, final warning. The words underneath were written in the familiar, cold, clinical tone of people trying to sound more official than they are. Your property remains in non-compliance with HOA Code 4.31. Unauthorized external structures. Failure to comply will result in enforced remediation and accruing penalties per Appendix B. There was no signature, just a stamped insignia that read Oak Glen Estates HOA, Compliance Division. Like they were a real governing body. Like they had deputies and courtrooms. I stared at the paper for a long time, my fingers curled against the doorframe, to stop them from tearing it down right then and there. But I didn't, not yet. Jasper whined behind me, nudging his nose against the side of my knee. The wind was picking up again, dry and fast, one of those pre-storm breezes that carries dust and static with it, that whispers through the trees like a warning only old bones and bad memories know how to read. I took the notice down and laid it on the kitchen table beside the others. I had them all saved like a running file in a courtroom drama that no one was watching. I made another copy, highlighted the specific code violation. Then I opened the HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions book, CC&Rs, they call it, and went looking for 4.31. It didn't exist. There was a 4.2.9 about ornamental fencing and a 4.3.3 about detached garages, but 4.3.1 wasn't even listed. They'd made it up. Flat out fabricated the rule. I'd seen this before back in the military with some officers who abused power when no one looked twice. Bureaucratic bluffs, false regulation to break resistance, paper threats that bank on silence. I decided I wasn't going to be silent anymore. The next morning, I drove to City Hall with my entire binder of documentation and asked to speak with the zoning enforcement officer. I got a meeting with a woman named Carla Suarez, mid-40s, sharp glasses. The kind of quiet authority that makes you sit straighter without realizing it. I explained everything. Showed her the permit, the photographs of the shelter before it was chained off the fake regulation on the latest notice. She took her time, flipped through the pages slowly. Then she looked up. "They're overstepping," she said plainly. "This shelter meets all municipal standards. You're fully permitted and compliant. So what happens now?" She tapped her pen against the folder. "We'll issue a letter from the city. An official warning that they're interfering with a permitted emergency structure. If they ignore it, we escalate." I nodded slowly. "They're not going to like that." "No," she said. "But they're also not going to win." That night, I slept a little better. Not because I trusted the process, but because I knew I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I was right, and I had the law on my side. But people like Karen don't care about the law. Not when they've built their entire identity on the illusion of control. She escalated. 2 days after my meeting with Carla, I came home from a supply run to find the back gate wide open, Jasper barking like mad from inside the house. And then I saw it. The chain was gone. So was the shelter door. Not unlocked, removed. The thick steel slab I had custom installed with dual latches and reinforced hinges gone. Ripped off entirely, like someone had pried it free with industrial tools. The frame was bent, the hinges twisted. Scraps of metal littered the grass like broken teeth. My chest went hollow. I ran to the entrance. The shelter itself was untouched, inside bare cots, water drums, battery lanterns, but now it was exposed, vulnerable, and worse, unusable. Without that door, it was just a pit in the ground. I stood there, frozen, heart-pounding, hands trembling not with fear but rage. No note, no explanation, no warning. Just silent, targeted destruction. I called the police. They came, took a report, said it was a civil matter. The officer, a young guy named Trent, shrugged a little too casually as he walked the perimeter. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," he said. "HOA disputes get weird." I handed him the photos, the documents, the permit. I showed him the city's letter. "I'm not crazy," I said, trying not to sound like I was pleading. He gave me that look. The one people give you when they've already decided you're making too much of a fuss. "We'll log it," he said. "But unless you can prove someone saw them do it, there's not much else we can do." That's when I realized I was on my own. They could walk onto my property, destroy critical infrastructure, and the system would shrug. Because it was HOA territory. Because people still believed HOA meant order, meant community, meant decency. They hadn't seen what I'd seen, what I remembered. The sirens in the distance, the smell of splintered wood and ozone. My mother's face the last time I ever saw it. No, I wasn't going to let them erase this shelter. I wasn't going to wait for another disaster to prove I was right. I would rebuild the door, reinforce the bolts, file the lawsuit. But that night, as I sat on the back steps staring at the open hole in the ground, something strange happened. Karen walked by. She was out for her evening walk, the one she took every day, in her matching jogging set with Muffin waddling behind her on a rhinestone leash. She didn't make eye contact, didn't pause, just kept walking like she didn't see the ruins of what she'd done. But she knew. And I saw it in the tight set of her jaw, in the flicker of her eyes, when she passed the satisfaction, the confidence, the belief that no one would ever hold her accountable. That's when I knew this wasn't just about code violations. This was about control, and she wasn't going to stop. I've known all kinds of authority figures in my life, officers, commanders, politicians, even a few warlords, but none of them scared me the way Karen Whitmore did. Not because she had power, but because she had just enough of it to think she was untouchable, and none of the responsibility to wield it with care. Karen ran the HOA Compliance Committee like a private kingdom. She had the bylaws memorized, highlighted, laminated. She quoted them like scripture at meetings, waved them around like she'd helped write the Constitution. But it wasn't about the rules. It was never about the rules. It was about personal control disguised as community order. A perfect lawn, matching mailbox posts, no Christmas lights after January 7th, and now, apparently, no storm shelters unless she personally approved the bolts and color palette. After my shelter door was torn off, I spent the next morning in a haze of anger so sharp it felt like electricity. I'd already filed another police report. I'd spoken with Carla at City Hall again. She was furious, promised to escalate things through the city attorney. But part of me knew it wouldn't matter unless I confronted the source. I showed up at her house just after 8 a.m. The neighborhood was still sleepy sprinklers ticking rhythmically on manicured lawns. Her husband Rick was pulling the trash bins to the curb in his robe and slippers when he saw me. His face paled. "She's not home," he blurted too quickly. "She's watching me through the blinds," I said. His mouth opened, then closed. He turned and walked back inside. A second later, the door creaked open. Karen stood there in her pink satin robe and house shoes, holding a mug that said #BossLady. Her expression was already hardened. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "And you shouldn't be destroying other people's property," I said, stepping forward. "You had someone rip my shelter door off." She didn't even blink. "We issued multiple notices. You refused to comply. It was permitted, legal, inspected. You don't have the authority." Her lips curled upward just slightly. "That's not your call." I took a breath. The city knows. They're getting involved. I have a lawyer. And when this hits court, your name is going to be on every exhibit. For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. I thought it might be hesitation, but no, it was calculation. "Michael," she said, stepping outside onto the porch, lowering her voice just enough to sound like we were sharing something intimate. "This neighborhood has standards. People pay good money to live in Oak Glen Estates because they don't want underground bunkers and doomsday preppers next door. Your structure makes people uncomfortable. It sends the wrong message. The message being," I said flatly, "that their lives might be worth protecting." She sighed and took a sip from her mug. "It's nothing personal." The words landed like a slap. I'd heard them before in different languages, from different uniforms. Always said right before someone does something inexcusable. "It's everything personal," I said, voice quiet but steady. "You've violated my rights. You've endangered people. And you've done it all under the name of aesthetics. That shelter could save lives." She looked away toward her perfectly trimmed hedges. "No one asked for it. I didn't build it for them. I built it because I've watched a tornado take everything I love. I'll be damned if I let it happen again." That struck something. I saw her grip tighten around the mug. But she didn't say sorry. She didn't admit to anything. "Rules are rules," she said finally. "Then you'd better follow them," I replied. "Because this time you're the one breaking them." I walked away before I said something I'd regret. But my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from fury. From helplessness wrapped in purpose. It was the same feeling I'd had overseas, when we'd find a rigged checkpoint, or a hidden tripwire. When you knew the enemy wasn't fighting fair, and you had to beat them anyway. That night, I emailed the footage from my motion cameras to Carla Clear Video of a truck with the HOA logo parked near my property the day the door disappeared. 2 men in reflective vests and unmarked uniforms, one with bolt cutters, the other holding a crowbar. She called me an hour later. "I've already submitted a formal complaint," she said, "and I forwarded the footage to the city attorney's office. This is destruction of a life-saving structure during declared storm season. That puts it under emergency infrastructure interference, which means they could be liable for more than just property damage, possibly reckless endangerment." That was something. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, a new sign went up in the community bulletin board near the mailbox cluster. Community safety reminder: unauthorized storm shelters pose risks to neighborhood infrastructure integrity. It wasn't signed, but everyone knew where it came from. I saw neighbors reading it, frowning, whispering. Some glanced toward my house like I'd brought something dangerous into their idyllic world, like I was a problem, not a solution. But others looked different. One older couple, the Harveys from the corner lot, stopped me later that day. "Michael," Mrs. Harvey said softly, "I just wanted to say, we think what they're doing to you is wrong. That shelter, it's a good idea." Mr. Harvey nodded. "My brother lost his home in Joplin. He would have given anything for something like that." I thanked them. It meant more than I expected. Because the truth was, Karen could write all the bulletins she wanted. But nature didn't give a damn about compliance codes. And sooner or later, the wind was going to blow. It was a Tuesday, hot windless, the kind of day where the sky looks too bright and too still, like it's holding its breath. I remember because I left the house early that morning to help a friend across town move some heavy furniture. I was only supposed to be gone for a few hours. Jasper stayed home with the blinds drawn and the ceiling fan on low. It felt like just another day. When I came back, everything was wrong. The gate was open again, swinging slowly in the breeze. The backyard was dead quiet. Jasper barked once through the window when he saw me, but then went quiet. I stepped out of my truck and immediately noticed the smell dust metal and something faintly chemical. And then I saw the truck. It was parked on the grass behind my house, white, unmarked except for a magnetic decal slapped onto the door. Oak Glen Estates HOA Facilities Team. 2 men were standing near my storm shelter. One held a crowbar. The other had a bolt cutter in one hand and a large industrial padlock in the other. Both were wearing reflective vests and baseball caps. They didn't look like contractors. They looked like guys from a moving crew. Untrained. Casual. The steel posts I had yanked out days earlier were back, only this time they were reinforced with fresh cement. A chain ran through them again, thicker, newer. This one bore a large red warning tag. Restricted. HOA property, do not tamper. My stomach dropped. My legs started moving before I realized I was sprinting across the lawn. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man with the bolt cutter jumped. The one with the crowbar stood his ground. "We're securing the structure per directive from the compliance committee," he said, like he was reading from a script. "That's my property." I snapped, standing between them and the shelter door. "You're trespassing. You're interfering with emergency infrastructure. This isn't just illegal, it's criminal." He shrugged. "We were told this was HOA jurisdiction." "You were told wrong." I took out my phone, started recording. His expression changed, not panicked, but annoyed. Like I was ruining an easy job. "I want your names, now." The second man turned away, started walking toward the truck. "Hey," I barked. "You move one more foot and I swear to God." They both froze. For a moment, we just stood there, 3 grown men in a perfectly mowed backyard, in the middle of a nice suburban neighborhood surrounded by bird feeders and lilac bushes, and the tension was thick enough to crack brick. Then I heard the click of a latch. Karen. She stood just beyond the fence, arms crossed, sunglasses on, lips curled into that same smug half-smile she always wore when she thought the rules had her back. "They're just doing their jobs, Michael," she said sweetly. "Maybe if you'd followed protocol." "There's no protocol for breaking into someone's shelter," I cut in. "This isn't a community sandbox. This is private property, and you've crossed a line. I've got board authorization. Board authorization doesn't override state law. You're interfering with emergency preparedness infrastructure in an active storm season. She flinched just slightly. I have the city's letter, the permits, the video evidence. You're done. Her smile didn't fade. Then sue us. She turned and walked away, heels clicking across her perfect pavers. The two men followed. I stood there for several long minutes. After they left, fists clenched jaw tight, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I should have taken the chain down. Should have ripped those posts out of the ground right then and there. But something stopped me. Not fear. Something heavier. A realization that I was dealing with people who didn't just bend rules, they rewrote them in real time. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt since the battlefield. The deep, cold pulse of threat without a uniform. Not from terrorists, not from insurgents, but from a woman with a clipboard and a grudge. I went inside, turned on the ceiling fan, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. That night, I filed a restraining order. I submitted a formal complaint to the city with all the footage attached. I called a civil rights attorney I'd met during a disaster response conference 3 years prior, an old contact who specialized in municipal overreach and property rights. I told him everything. He paused on the other end of the line, then said, "You're not going to like how deep this might go." "Try me," I said. He told me about other HOA cases, like mine, small communities that operated like fiefdoms. Compliance committees turned into roving bands of control freaks, with zero legal training but maximum entitlement. And when no one pushed back, they grew more brazen. "They always think no one will fight," he said, "until someone does." That night, I sat on the floor next to Jasper, who curled up beside me like he knew I needed grounding. A storm shelter wasn't just concrete and bolts. It was a line in the sand. It was everything. I had prepared for not just against wind and rain, but against the creeping erosion of common sense and personal rights. I wasn't going to move. I wasn't going to bend. And I damn sure wasn't going to be chained out of my own shelter while people like Karen smiled behind locked clubhouse doors. The restraining order was filed under Section 22 of the Texas Civil Practices and Remedies Code, specifically citing interference with life-saving infrastructure. My lawyer, Evan Banks, made sure the language was sharp: deliberate obstruction, unauthorized entry, targeted harassment during emergency weather season. We weren't pulling punches. But the thing about people like Karen and HOAs, like Oak Glen Estates, is that they don't panic when the law knocks. They ignore it, delay it. They send it into committee, dilute it in jargon, hide behind the armor of bureaucracy. The first letter Evan sent to the HOA's management company got no response. The second, sent certified with legal threat of suit, was acknowledged with a one-line email from a HOA legal liaison named Brett Simmons. "We are reviewing the matter internally." That was their favorite phrase. Internally. Everything was internal. Internal reviews, internal policies, internal decisions. Like the HOA was a sovereign nation that existed above municipal code and natural law. I kept going. I sent letters to the city council. I posted documentation on the neighborhood Facebook page. I even printed flyers and handed them out at the post office and gas station detailing the timeline of events, everything from the illegal chaining of my shelter to the removal of the steel door. People started noticing. Some neighbors looked away when they saw me coming. Others gave me nods of quiet solidarity. A few brave ones, like the Harveys, openly supported me, leaving kind notes on my porch with messages like, "Hang in there," and "You're doing the right thing." I kept every single one. But for every whisper of support, Karen's grip on the HOA only tightened. 1 week after I filed the restraining order, a new community-wide bulletin went out. In response to recent misinformation circulating about neighborhood safety standards, the board reminds all residents that unauthorized modifications to properties, especially those visible from shared spaces, are subject to strict review. Violators will be fined accordingly. No names, no references. Just enough legal gray space to cover their backs while targeting me directly. But Evan didn't flinch. He filed a cease and desist letter addressed specifically to the Oak Glen Estates Board, citing municipal overreach property damage and personal harassment. He gave them 10 days to respond. They didn't. Instead, they passed a new emergency infrastructure amendment to the community bylaws, voted in at an unpublicized board meeting at 7:00 a.m. on a Monday, stating that all storm shelters must be aesthetically compatible with community architecture and approved by the compliance committee before installation. Retroactive enforcement was implied. When I saw the document, I laughed. Looks like they wrote it on the back of a napkin, Evans said. It's like they want to get sued. Oh, they will. The next day, I received a bill in the mail. Compliance fine. Emergency structure violation. They were charging me retroactively for the shelter, claiming it had created visual disharmony and lowered surrounding property values. That was the breaking point. I marched straight into the management company's office that afternoon, binder in hand, copies of every permit inspection and photograph. The receptionist gave me a look like I was a live grenade walking in. I need to speak to Brett Simmons, I said. She hesitated. Mr. Simmons isn't taking walk-ins. He'll take this one, I said, placing the binder on the counter like a warrant. After 20 minutes in the freezing lobby, Brett appeared. Thin man, polo shirt too tight at the neck, greasy smile. Mr. Grant, I understand there's been some confusion. It's not confusion, I said. It's obstruction. It's harassment. And it's going to cost your HOA 6 figures when this hits civil court. He held up a hand. Let's not escalate. It escalated the day your contractors destroyed emergency infrastructure on private land during declared tornado season. He opened the binder, scanned the photos, the letters, the video stills. This isn't going away, I said. I'll take this to the board. You do that, and let them know the next letter you get will come stamped by a judge. I left without another word, but the silence that followed was louder than any shouting match. A week passed, then 2. No response from the board, no email, no phone call, just a void of accountability. The padlock was still on my shelter. And then, the clouds came. It started subtle. Wind, the scent of ozone, hushed warnings from the local news about atmospheric instability. I knew the signs. I'd grown up with them. You could smell a tornado the way you smell gasoline metallic wrong heavy with memory. People in the neighborhood began asking questions. Is that shelter still locked? Did the HOA really do that? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just stocked the shelter. Fresh batteries, sealed food, bottled water. I fixed what I could with the door. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for now. I wasn't afraid of the storm. I was afraid of what the HOA would do. After it hit, the spin, the silence, the shifting blame. But what I didn't know then was that nature had a plan of its own, and it was coming for them. The wind shifted on a Wednesday. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a change in direction, a strange stillness between the tree branches. The kind of unnatural quiet that made the air feel too thick for a spring afternoon. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the clouds roll in like slow bruises across the sky. Jasper stood beside me, ears alert, his nose twitching toward the horizon. Something was coming. I checked the radar on my phone. There was already a system forming just west of us, the kind of swirling cell meteorologists called classic supercell structure. They'd been warning all week that conditions were ripe, but now it felt inevitable. I'd seen it before on screens on satellite images, and once with my own eyes 20 years ago, when the sky over my childhood town went green and the sirens failed. This time I was ready, except I wasn't allowed to be. The HOA padlock still hung across the chain posts in front of my storm shelter like a mocking smile. I could technically cut it open by law, I had the right, but I knew how people like Karen played the game. They wanted me to break it. They were waiting to catch me in vandalism or tampering with private HOA property, even if that property was my own goddamn land. So I didn't cut it. I filed another emergency notice with the city attaching a photo of the locked shelter with the incoming storm warnings circled in red. I tagged it. Obstruction of critical emergency shelter during active tornado advisory. I copied the local news station too, just in case someone decided to care. That evening, a knock came at my door. It was Greg Harvey. Mid-60s retired school principal, lived 2 houses over. He stood there with a flashlight in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. Is it true, he asked? Your shelter's still sealed. I nodded. HOA hasn't removed the lock. His jaw tightened. They've gone mad. Behind him stood his wife Martha, clutching a purse and a grocery bag full of bottled water. We'd like to shelter with you, she said gently, if it comes. I stepped aside. You're welcome anytime. They weren't the only ones. By 9 p.m., 4 more people had shown up, neighbors I barely knew, each holding supplies, blankets. One even brought his cat in a plastic carrier. None of them asked permission. They just stood there in the driveway, eyes wide, scanning the clouds above, as the first rumbles of thunder cracked like distant gunfire. I told the HOA we were going to Michael's, one woman muttered. Karen said that shelter is not approved. I told her I don't give a damn about her approval. I took a deep breath. We may need to act quickly, I said. The door's compromised, but it's functional. If the wind hits hard, stay low, backs to the wall. I've got cots, food, water, emergency lights, radios. You sure? Greg asked. I built it for this, I said, even if they don't want us to have it. Around 11 p.m. the siren started. A long rising wail, fractured by wind, echoed off rooftops. Official now. The National Weather Service had declared a tornado warning for our county. I turned on the emergency radio. A calm voice stated coordinates, radar confirmations, words like rotation shelf cloud, funnel touchdown, likely. And then it happened. A sound unlike anything else. Deep primal wrong. Not thunder, not wind, a kind of roaring vacuum, like the world itself was being sucked inside out. The house groaned. The lights flickered. Jasper barked once, sharp and loud. Go, I shouted. We moved as a unit through the kitchen, out the back door, into the darkened yard. The sky was flashing strobe white and sick green. The fence was bending in the gusts, the trees dancing like drunks in a riot. When we reached the shelter, I yanked off the tarp covering the entrance. The chain was still there. I held up the bolt cutter, looked at Greg. This is trespassing according to them. He grinned grimly. Then I'll be your accomplice. I cut the chain. The lock clanged to the grass like a guillotine blade falling. We pulled open the door. I ushered everyone inside, 7 neighbors, 2 pets, and 1 elderly man who'd nearly tripped over the threshold in his hurry. Last in was Jasper. I slammed the door shut behind us, sealed it as best I could with the latches, then braced it with a metal rod I'd installed during the build. Inside the air was still. My emergency lights clicked on soft yellow glow, casting long shadows against the concrete walls. I moved from face to face, checking for panic, for breath, for clarity. Then the ground shook. The sound outside rose to a hellish pitch, like freight trains and wailing steel and thousands of fists pounding on the roof of the earth all at once. Dust fell from the vents. One woman whimpered. Someone prayed. Jasper pressed tight against my leg. I knelt near the corner, radio in hand, tuning through static until I heard the words. Confirmed touchdown near Oak Glen Estates. Debris signature detected. Significant structural damage. My heart thudded once hard, then again. I knew what that meant. The tornado hadn't just passed nearby. It hit us. Hard. The rest of the night was a blur of noise and waiting. After the worst passed, I didn't let anyone leave for another 45 minutes, just in case of a second wave. We stayed huddled, wrapped in donated blankets, breathing heavy, listening to the silence above, like it was a trapdoor ready to spring open. When we finally emerged just after dawn, the sun was rising through a haze of dust, and the Oak Glen Clubhouse, the proud centerpiece of Karen's empire, was gone, leveled. All that remained was a twisted playground of shattered beams, crumbled brick, and a dangling, crooked sign that read, Welcome Home. We stood in stunned silence at the edge of the wreckage, the soft crunch of broken shingles beneath our feet, the only sound for miles. The tornado hadn't just brushed the neighborhood, it had cut through it like a blade. And the first structure in its path was the Oak Glen Clubhouse, the building that once held HOA meetings, community luncheons, and wine and cheese compliance briefings, now looked like a war zone. Its frame was a mangled mess of aluminum and concrete. The roof had been peeled off and thrown across the tennis court like a paper plate. The east wall had collapsed entirely, exposing what remained of a community office desk, now buried beneath cinder blocks and rain-soaked file folders. A woman's voice cracked in the morning air. Oh my God, they were inside. I turned sharply. Across the field of debris, 3 figures stumbled from behind what used to be the parking structure: Karen Whitmore, her husband Rick, and a young man I didn't recognize. Their clothes were torn, caked in mud and plaster dust. Karen's hair clung to her face in wet clumps. Her arms wrapped protectively around her chest, like the building had collapsed not just on top of her, but inside her. She wasn't screaming now. She was shaking. When she saw me standing with Greg Harvey and the others near the shelter, her eyes widened. Not with anger, not with accusation, but recognition. Because we were fine, and she knew why. We had been inside the shelter, the same one she had tried to destroy, padlock, and shame me for building. It was Greg who broke the silence. We were safe, he said. We all were, because of Michael. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. Her face flickered between disbelief and disbelief again, like her brain was stuck trying to process a version of events where she wasn't the hero. Paramedics arrived shortly after. The tornado had taken a wide, vicious path, but by sheer luck or cruel irony, the worst of its wrath had focused itself on the HOA clubhouse and a handful of surrounding properties, while the rest of the neighborhood escaped with broken fences and debris-strewn lawns. City officials showed up by noon. So did the press. I stood behind the yellow caution tape as a local news crew interviewed a teary Martha Harvey on live TV. He saved us, she said, voice trembling but clear. That shelter, he built it himself years ago. The HOA tried to lock it, tried to shut it down. But he kept it, and thank God he did. A younger woman chimed in, Sasha, from the cul-de-sac, holding her toddler tight. If it weren't for Michael, we wouldn't be here. They left us with nowhere to go. They locked our only safe place and told us to wait it out. The reporter, a clean-cut man with a furrowed brow, looked directly into the camera. This raises serious questions about HOA authority and responsibility during natural disasters. We've reached out to Oak Glen Estates Board for comment, but so far, no response. No response because the board had no comment to give. They were too busy digging themselves out of rubble, both physical and reputational. By the next morning, the story had hit regional news. The headline on one site read, "Neighborhood storm shelter locked by HOA residents survive tornado after breaking in." My name was mentioned, so was Karen's. I didn't speak to her that day or the next. I watched from my porch as the HOA clubhouse was cordoned off with city-issued tape. Engineers assessed the damage. Code enforcement combed the scene. Drones buzzed overhead filming what had once been Karen's kingdom. 3 days after the tornado, I got a knock on my door. It wasn't a neighbor this time. It was Carla Suarez from the city's zoning office, flanked by 2 municipal officers and a woman with a clipboard from the Office of Emergency Management. They came inside, reviewed my shelter plans again, inspected the damage to the frame, asked thoughtful, serious questions. Then Carla said something I'll never forget. "You did more for this neighborhood's safety than the HOA ever did." She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a certificate of municipal exemption and emergency use designation. In plain terms, she said this shelter is now officially city-acknowledged emergency infrastructure. And under current state code, no private organization, including any HOA, has authority to alter, block, or regulate it in any way. I stared at the document, speechless. Carla smiled. "We're also opening a formal investigation into HOA practices here. The city council's already been briefed." Later that afternoon, I saw Karen in her yard. She was sweeping broken glass from her porch, moving slowly, methodically, like she didn't want to be seen, but couldn't bear to stay hidden. Her face was pale, her hands shaking ever so slightly. We made eye contact. She opened her mouth, maybe to say something, maybe even to apologize. But she didn't. She just stood there. And I didn't move. Because sometimes silence is the most powerful statement of all. It didn't take long for the lawsuits to start piling up. Within 2 weeks of the tornado, Oak Glen Estates found itself buried beneath a different kind of storm. This one made of subpoenas, deposition requests, and formal letters from every office, with a seal and a fax machine. I didn't have to lift a finger. The people did it for me. Martha and Greg Harvey filed first. Emotional distress, reckless endangerment, obstruction of emergency shelter. Then came Sasha and the old man with the cat and the family from Cypress Street, who hadn't made it into my shelter in time and had spent the tornado cowering in their crawl space with their twin daughters while the wind clawed at their roof. Even some who didn't take shelter with me joined in filing complaints, demanding an overhaul of the HOA leadership, calling for transparency and the immediate resignation of the entire board. The local paper ran a front-page headline, "Community Left Vulnerable by HOA Shelter Saved 7. But it wasn't just the lawsuits that broke them. It was the publicity. The news stations that showed aerial shots of the flattened clubhouse. The interviews with seniors who had begged the HOA for safer emergency protocols, only to be dismissed as paranoid. The freeze-frame clip of Karen saying rules are rules in a pre-storm community meeting replayed so many times it became a meme. I still remember the anchor's voice. Tonight at 6 when HOA power goes too far and nature strikes back. I couldn't walk into a grocery store without someone stopping me. You're the guy with the shelter, right? God bless you, man. You saved lives. My cousin's HOA is freaking out now. They're updating all their storm policies because of you. It was surreal. I didn't ask for attention. I didn't want to be a symbol. I just didn't want people to die for the sake of a regulation. But there it was, my storm shelter now repainted, resecured, recertified, plastered across every HOA reform article in the state. City Hall called me next. The mayor's assistant invited me to speak at a council meeting, and for the first time in my life, I stood at a podium, not in uniform, not in a courtroom, not as someone testifying to trauma, but as someone testifying to change. I told them about my mother, about the bathtub, about the mattress she threw over me before the tornado took her. I told them about the shelter I built with my own hands, about the first notice, the chain, the padlock, about Karen's smug smile and the words, "No one asked for it." And I told them what happened when the wind came anyway. They listened. Then they voted unanimously to adopt a new municipal ordinance. No HOA in the city could regulate, prohibit, obstruct, or tamper with any structure deemed necessary for life safety by the homeowner and permitted by city code. The crowd clapped, but I didn't smile. Because outside that chamber in the real world, Karen was still fighting. She'd gone quiet in public, but behind the scenes she'd hired her own lawyer, a sharp-tongued man from Dallas, who specialized in community integrity defense. She claimed the HOA had only acted in accordance with aesthetic preservation, and that the real issue was the city's inconsistent permitting guidelines. But no amount of spin could change what everyone now knew. They'd locked people out of safety, and I had let people in. That was the difference. City code investigators showed up at HOA headquarters next. They confiscated files, logs, emails. Rumors spread that Karen had falsified several of the violation notices, even backdated certain board votes that had never actually happened. If true, it meant she'd not only abused her power, she'd fabricated it too. By the end of the month, she was removed from her position. Not resigned. Removed. A rare emergency clause in the HOA bylaws allowed for a forcible recall by community petition if misconduct could be reasonably proven and documented. We needed 53 signatures. We got 89. They posted the results on the same bulletin board where she once pinned that community safety reminder about my shelter. Someone had scribbled underneath it in red Sharpie, "Safety 1." I never saw Karen again after that day. Rick sold their house quietly 2 weeks later. A moving truck came before dawn. No neighbors waved goodbye. No one offered help. They vanished like smoke from a burned-out fire. But the damage they left behind, that stayed. Even after the city leveled the remains of the clubhouse, the neighborhood had a scar. One made of silent suspicion and the uncomfortable knowledge that for too long, we all let them get away with it. That's what power does when no one checks it. It rots. But that shelter, it stood. I repainted it navy blue, replaced the steel door with a heavier one, installed a biometric lock, added a generator ventilation redundancy, even a backup radio tower. The city offered to pay for it. I said no. This wasn't theirs. This was mine. And next time, because there's always a next time, no one would have to ask permission to survive. The key to the new storm shelter was different. Not just in shape, it was heavier digital embedded in a fob with a fingerprint scanner and a silent alarm system. But what made it matter wasn't the tech. It was the principle. That key tucked against my chest in a lanyard I wore beneath my shirt represented something no one could regulate, fine, or chain up again. Autonomy, preparedness, and dignity. A few months had passed since the storm. Oak Glen Estates looked cleaner on the surface, fresher paint-trimmed hedges, new flowers planted along the sidewalk to replace the ones ripped up in the tornado. But beneath it all there was a stillness, a tension that hadn't quite lifted. People were quieter at community events. Meetings were sparsely attended. The new interim HOA board, assembled reluctantly from reluctant neighbors, mostly focused on fixing potholes and cleaning up paperwork. No more fines for mailbox colors. No more Karen-style crusades. Just the basics. Sometimes that's all people want, to be left in peace. The funny thing is, no one talks about the clubhouse anymore. It's like it was never there. The city hauled the debris away, graded the lot, and filled the crater with grass seed. Now it's just an empty patch of earth, flat, quiet. A reminder of what happens when control outweighs care. As for Karen last, I heard she'd moved into a gated community upstate. No HOA leadership role this time. Just a plain garden variety homeowner, one among many. I don't know if she ever told her new neighbors what happened here. I doubt she did. But I still see her sometimes. Not her exactly, but her type, in the way someone on a city planning board scoffs at floodplain warnings, or when a property manager rolls their eyes at the word shelter. That same air of dismissal. That same belief that rules matter more than people. It doesn't scare me anymore. Because I'm not the same man I was when this all started. Back then, I just wanted to be left alone. To protect myself quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. I'd built that shelter not for applause or permission, but because I'd seen what happened when people weren't ready. I thought if I did it right, if I followed the rules, they'd let me be. They didn't. So I learned to always speak up, to stand my ground, to cut the chain before the storm hits. A few weeks ago, Greg and Martha Harvey came by with banana bread. We sat on my porch drinking coffee as Jasper snoozed in a sunbeam at our feet. Greg asked if I ever thought about leaving. Leaving Oak Glen, I said. He nodded. After everything, I wouldn't blame you. I looked out at the neighborhood, the picket fences, the faded chalk drawings on the sidewalks, the kids riding bikes, again now that the cul-de-sac was clear of debris. No, I said. This is still my home. They didn't say anything for a while. Just nodded. I walked them to the edge of the driveway and watched them go sunlight, casting long shadows across the pavement. Then I turned back toward the yard where the shelter sat low quiet, unobtrusive but there, ready. I descended the steps and opened the door. Cool air met my face. The light flicked on with a low hum. Everything was in place, water, food supplies, backups. I walked to the far wall and ran my fingers across the smooth steel that used to be dented and bent by crowbars. For a while, I just stood there. Not because I was afraid, but because I was proud. I'd kept the key. I'd kept my voice. And in a world where storms of wind, of power of people, can take everything in seconds, holding on to even one small piece of dignity, that's survival. That's victory. That's home.